Greetings all. So, racial tensions. This one's a little bit less numbers based and it's a little bit more opinion based. And you know what they say about opinions. Anyway, the goal here is to approach things kind of as always from a little bit different of an angle. And hopefully two sides to this argument can see where each other's coming from. So, there have always been racial, religious, ideological, sexual, etc. divides in this country, and pretty much for that matter all over the world. I mean, it's not a new issue, but it seems like the news has been focusing more on it in the last 5 or so years than in the last 25 years, ever since the LA riots really. So are things really spiraling out of control? Have things just been kind of building under pressure and the vessel's letting off steam right before it explodes? Seems pretty severe, but you know, it's kind of a yes, that is kind of what's happening, but from a number standpoint, it just, and a statistical standpoint, it just doesn't quite add up. Things have only really been improving and becoming more tolerant, and people becoming more accepting in the last several decades, but the way that news portrays it, it seems almost like it's the civil rights movements from the 1960s and 70s all over again. So the problem I see isn't that cops are racists, or that, say, Muslims are all terrorists, or the gays are trying to destroy the sanctity of marriage. I see the real problem is, or the real thing I take issue with, is the whole setting back of diversity in this country. So I take pride in diversity in this country, and well, anywhere you can get it really, and I embraced a plethora of different cultures that I used to see while living in California, or the freedoms gays have kind of had now in the past decade compared to 20 plus years ago when it was taboo, or even some of the backwoods mamma jammas I encountered while I was living in Florida from the guys hailing from around Lake Okeechobee. So diversity is awesome, and when you embrace it, you can really appreciate so much more in life, I think, rather than a closed-minded person who just lives in their little bubble and they're just not really aware of what's out there because they're closed up. So it seemed like I'd be on the front lines of every protest whenever a white cop was to shoot a black person, or I'd be waving a rainbow flag whenever like the whole Prop 8 stuff was going on in California. I mean, hey, look at all the people jumping on this whole Muslims aren't terrorist type bandwagon on social media. So I should be running with all those crowds, but I don't. I don't do any of that stuff, even though I respect and I actually ultimately celebrate diversity. So why is that? Why am I not jumping on all these bandwagons? It's because making a bunch of noise for non-issues can turn something that might be a non-issue into an issue. So the news outlets love conflict. They love tension. That's kind of what they get ratings from. So people watch news and they get whipped into a frenzy or a blind fervor, and they jump full force into issues without logic or facts. And a lot of it's just premature. So then a simple tragic news story turns into a national crisis. Things turn into a big us versus them battle. And then that results in riots, further injuries, criminal charges, and sometimes even, more deaths. And I believe that all lives matter, and nearly any loss of life is tragic. So if someone you know is killed, you want to mourn that person, and I believe that's totally acceptable. I mean, that's your religious or personal freedom. And if you believe there's been some injustice caused, it's your right as an American to demand answers, to kind of be able to look into that. And if you read about someone in the news who was killed, and you drive from several states away to protest, or more accurately start some shit, then shame on you. You're actually more of a problem than the original problem oftentimes. So there is a difference between wanting to support an issue and kind of get behind one, and getting in the way. So there are plenty of things in the news which people don't agree with and they want to support. Fair enough. As an American, you have the right to voice that opinion, and there's nothing wrong with that. The problem is when people exercise that into the extreme, usually without all the facts, or they wind up doing additional damage. So the "well, I'm mad as hell" reasoning is just utter crap. And a good example of something where people done more damage over a terrible injustice was the West Memphis Three, which in 1993 in West Memphis, in a smaller area, three boys who were all friends were found murdered. And they were discovered in the woods. They were mutilated, they were sexually assaulted and tortured, and it's just totally unfair that anyone, let alone such young people, were dealt this fate. And it would ultimately shock the community to the core. So, should people be mad? Absolutely. I'm not arguing that. There weren't riots or anything, which is good and kind of miraculous. But this whole someone needs to pay for this or someone needs to answer for this mentality, it snowballed. And so ultimately 3 teenagers were blamed. You know, it was a typical small community that had some outcast kids who were kind of going to the beat of their own drum type thing. And then rumors swept and things kind of escalated, and without any real evidence or anything, without motive and with really questionable police work, the three teenagers went to trial. So ultimately one of the 3 was sentenced to life plus 40 years, the second got life, and then the third was sentenced to death. And these were 3 people determined that committed these crimes, and the 3 were removed from the system, and so everything should be fixed. Everything's all hunky-dory. The problem is the 3 were innocent and would serve nearly 20 years apiece in prison, and then the one on death row would spend a bulk of that time in solitary confinement. And then them being released was contingent kind of on a little bit of a loophole, a legal loophole, where they were freed from prison, but they couldn't turn around and demand retribution or anything from the system. So it was kind of a no harm, no foul sort of deal. So in the witch hunt that took place, shoddy police work took place, and they were just in a rush to pin the crime on these 3 teenagers, and they overlooked some really highly likely suspects. And, you know, they stirred the public to get swift justice, and essentially prejudged these 3, and it pretty much was a guarantee that they were going to go down for this crime. And it's a very interesting story, and it's also a very sad story at the same time, that not only did these 3 use the ones that died lose their lives, but the 3 teenagers that got pinned for the crimes, their lives were ultimately ruined, and in the end, the identity of the killer or killers might not ever be known. You know, it's so long ago, and evidence is gone. So 20 plus years later, here we are with the national news fanning flames of every single tragedy that pops up, and people want justice. And then when events went down in Ferguson, for instance, people were whipped into a frenzy, and most of the protesters and rioters that went to Ferguson for this cause weren't even from the area, not even from the state, the bulk of them. So millions of dollars of property damage, several lost jobs, you know, in the police force there, and a lot of media attention later. What was the point? What did we gain? The public was divided into this is police brutality and we're not going to stand for it any longer camps. And then the whole, this kid was just a total bully and a criminal and he resisted arrest, he was asking for it camps. So the issue snowballed. Public opinions were formed, and for no good reason. If people were really interested in the story and they suspected injustice, then waiting for all the facts and then waiting for the outcome would be the best course. So you can really get to the heart of the matter, but that's not what people wanted. And then really only about a dozen or so people really needed to be at the heart of the issue until all the facts were known. So it turns out that upon a lot of investigation, the kid was kind of a bad egg, and making him into some sort of martyr only makes sense to the people that are trying to kind of justify their own wrongdoings or trying to find some consolation that they were wrong. So hold him up on a pedestal. And then what about the cop that did the shooting? Well, it ended his career. He's no longer a police officer, and he had to uproot and basically leave the state. So the whole police force was subjected to scrutiny, and it turned the entire issue into a racial one. So now it's, you know, the blacks versus the whites all over again. Well, congratulations, people. You just set racial equality back by decades and ruined more people's lives, and you were wrong. If the media didn't blow this issue up, The facts would have exonerated the police officer. Some people would have mourned the loss of Michael Brown, and this could have all been chalked up to just a troubled kid who lived outside the law and rolled the dice one too many times and paid the ultimate price. It's still a tragedy, it's still life lost, but instead now racial inequality is becoming an issue. And now police officers have to walk on eggshells around non-white people because, heaven forbid, if anything happens, there's an altercation, let's say, well, then that could cause riots, that could cause more big civil problems. So with any profession, there are going to be wrongdoers. That's kind of the name of the game. And it's always going to be a small percentage, and there's just lower morale people interweaved in society. That's how things work. That's just statistics. And then painting all police officers as being racist, abusing their powers and everything, that's a fallacy of the whole. There are bad cops, and let the facts come to light before condemning all police. It's not a racial issue. It's not a police brutality issue. It's a non-issue. And bringing it to such levels of national attention is only damaging society. And it's pitting people against one another, even when a decade or so ago, if these same events happened, nothing probably would have resulted from it. It's just, it caught wind, and it just caught a spark. So this transgresses next into religion, affiliation, or religious affiliations as well. The Paris attacks were a tragedy, and it was performed by a radicalist group of Muslims. So are Muslims terrorists? No. Just as with the entire police force, there's a couple bad eggs, and ISIS is not only a group of bad eggs, they're not even really Muslims. They're anarchists. They're just trying to upset the status quo, and they're hiding behind this whole veil of religion. So shedding any light on a religion is going to cause backlash against the entire religion. That's what happens. So Muslim is a religion, and identifying Muslims is pretty hard to do, and since that's the predominant religion in the Middle East, people kind of shed light on the entire Middle East. And so everybody that's Middle Eastern gets a black eye. So people are skeptical, and again, making a fallacy of the whole on an entire continent out of ignorance and anger. So nothing is gained, and it's not going to undo attacks and losses of life, and getting angry and posting on Facebook or protesting, it's not getting you anywhere. ISIS gladly claims ownership of these attacks, so if you want to be mad, you can be legitimately mad at that group. It's not a religious issue. And so the next problem here is people say, oh, it doesn't matter if 99% of a group is okay. If you assume the entire group is good and then just forget about that 1%, you're going to get caught with your pants down. And yes, the 1% does blend in, so it is hard to discern that fraction, but no one is advocating just blowing off everybody. If 99% of a group are not a threat, then yes, you treat them as a normal group. Less than 1% of school teachers, for instance, might diddle your kids, but we don't all alienate all teachers and say, hey, all teachers are bad, just in case that one teacher is that 1% that is going to do some wrongdoings. Same with the food industry. If 1% or so of people in the food industry might spit in your food, let's insist on watching everybody that goes anywhere near your food. Let's distrust the wait staff. Let's just be really paranoid every time we go to a restaurant, or stop going to restaurants for that matter. And then a small fraction, albeit larger than 1% probably, of auto mechanics are a little shady. So should you be very cautious about auto mechanics and get second, third, and fourth opinions anytime you have anything done with your car? See, that's exactly the slippery slope with being overly cautious and paranoid of an entire group because of a few bad eggs. That logic trap would result in everyone locking his or herself up to avoid everyone else. Being overly anxious all the time, and whenever you're out in public especially, and then that would turn pretty much all society into hermits. Kind of like how things are progressing now. So in that case, the terrorists do win. So no, being leery of an entire religious, ideological, professional, sexual orientation group, etc. is bad. Bad, bad, bad. Groups like Internal Affairs are an outside organization, and they specifically investigate different branches of law enforcement to kind of get to the root cause of problems that arise. Leave it to them to find the bad egg police officers. Don't leave it to the misinformed public to just form opinions and speculation. They won't catch things before they're an issue per se, but they're the best equipped for uncovering the facts after an issue. Then health inspectors, they review restaurants and they evaluate the cleanliness. And sure, it's not going to catch all the bad eggs, especially when there's one individual that might do nefarious things, but there are going to be the ones that review the restaurant for overall cleanliness, storage practices, food preparation procedures, etc. So they're much better equipped and much more experienced at finding potential health risks on a big scale, and then that kind of trickles down and that'll catch some of the smaller scale stuff. So you're mad about ISIS? Well, even shining the smallest bit of light on Muslims, be it condoning or praising them, is bringing attention to the wrong group. It's ultimately the job of the military, the government, intelligence agencies, and then other governments, militaries, and intelligence agencies to coordinate to pinpoint those bad eggs. They'll do a hell of a lot more to those ends than a paranoid public pursuing a witch hunt. So instead of focusing a lot of energy against ISIS, they'll have to expend energy here stateside, kind of aiding and assisting Muslim people that are threatened, or having to watch over fear-mongering groups in the U.S., which might cause civil disobedience. So it's a lose-lose for everybody. And then finally, the last thing I'll really touch on with all this is kind of communities that bring light upon themselves in a negative manner, such as the gay community. I don't believe in labels, as I've talked about in my introductory video, as a simple label falsely tries to encompass everything there is about a person into one neat little box. If you can completely identify with a single label, then I kind of pity you, and I question, are you a robot? So having pride in something, totally fine. And there's a big difference between having pride and being proud of something, and then shoving it in people's faces. If you want Indian food, or if you're Indian and you want to cook me a meal that's kind of been passed down through your family through generations for hundreds of years, yes please. If every time I talk to you, the only thing you ever talk about is India, and anytime the conversation diverges, you always steer it back to topics about India, it's going to probably get pretty old, and I might eventually just start to avoid you. I've known people from cultures like Puerto Rico that they'll talk about Puerto Rico every single conversation, and they'll just talk about how it's the best place in the world, and everything is just Puerto Rico, Puerto Rico. Well, if it's so terrible here, why don't you go back? If I was in a state or a country that I didn't like very much and I didn't feel comfortable with, and the homeland was so glorious, I'd try to get back to where I was from. So the gay community, I support that sexual orientation, and I have no qualms whatsoever with them, just because their sexual orientation is different than mine. Whoop-de-doo. It doesn't affect me one bit. It's like someone from a different country, though. If you celebrate your culture, or in this case, you're accepting of your sexuality, good for you. It's great that in this age and in this country, you don't have to worry about being as negatively viewed by your peers. You don't have to worry about being arrested or exiled or anything, or executed. When people use it as a label, though, and then they steer every conversation to it, then you're taking one facet of yourself and identifying yourself that way, and only that way. So say you're a chef who likes to go snowboarding in the winter, happen to be gay, and you have affinity for crossword puzzles and maybe even like knitting. Those are various things that help kind of paint an overall picture of who you are, but being gay is just one little bit. Some people, however, talk non-stop about their sexual orientation, and then they'll talk about, they're protesting because some business, the CEO doesn't like gay people, or they talk about how they're always being judged because of their sexual orientation. And it's just that everything always leads back to that. Well, guess what? You talking about being gay all the time is labeling yourself and either, oops, and either irritating people because that's all you talk about, or the people that are kind of uncomfortable on edge about the topic that are suddenly very aware of your orientation because that's all you talk about. So you can be gay, but it's not the be-all end-all. You have other qualities, and constantly shining the spotlight on that one quality, it's going to get attention, and sometimes it's not good attention. You know, surprisingly, Americans are a lot more tolerant of the gay community, as well as all the other aforementioned religious, racial, professional, etc. groups. So, coming full circle, to say most of all this social tension is a non-issue kind of comes back to that. Diversity is much more embraced, and blowing these issues up into the news only is working to set diversity back, and that's a bad thing. So if you want social equality, it's there. It really is. Things are just amazing anymore. So people are very diverse in this country, and it is really quite the melting pot where people's race, religion, ideologies, orientation, etc. are indistinguishable from your neighbors. We're all mixed together, and not using a loudspeaker to just blast in everyone's face your, your one little niche that you just can't get over, your religion or your orientation, etc. And then you jump to conclusions and all bum rush every news story to show your support or aversion. We can all start to really harmonize and kind of grow. This country is truly a glorious thing. So can't we all just get along? Cheerio.